Okay, so this gets us now to the introduction part of the course. So as I said, the idea today basically is to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what basic income is, where does it come from, what's going on with the debate, and a little bit of a teaser of what we will be discussing in depth later on. I was just going to say, Antti, you may want to regulate my time thing because I'm very, very bad at time. So you're the time master. If I start talking too long, just stop me. Okay?
I'll just leave.
Yeah. Okay, good. Right. So first starting point, I wanted to start with this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. So Thomas Paine, Agrarian Justice. So this is someone from the time of the American Revolution, right? So this is like one of these revolutionary utopians. And he wrote the following. This is one of his proposals. He basically says, we should create a national fund out of which there shall be paid to every person the sum of £10 per year during life, to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others as they shall arrive at that age. Okay? And it's proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich or poor. So this is one of the most famous early statements of basic income. He's talking about every person. He's not making any distinctions, really. There's a little age thing here, but the assumption is, as everyone gets to that, we'll receive that. But very specifically, the same amount of money is supposed to go to the rich and the poor, right? Tom Paine's argument was mainly that the reason why we should be doing this is because, we had enclosures of resources and so on and so forth, so people should be entitled to the wealth of the common pool of resources, okay? So this is one of the early, it's not the first one by any means, but it's one of the early statements. This is just to illustrate that this basic income debate has really been going on for quite some years. This is a couple of 100 years. And as time moves, we see this idea popping up in various places and amongst various people. So it keeps popping up and down and popping up and down. So this is not a recent debate, right, by any means. So I'm not a historian, so I'm going to do something that historians are not allowed to do. I'm just going to move a couple of 100 years, right? So now we're going to talk post-World War. So what's been happening in basic income in recent times? I mean, what's been going on in the debate? Well, in a way, the modern debate of basic income is something that started in the 70s, 80s, if you want. This is the time when people really started taking it seriously. By the way, there is an international organization called BN, the Basic Income Earth Network. That started in 1986. So that's the first time that an official network was started up. And from there, now we have an international network, and we have a huge amount of networks in different countries, right? Including Finland, of course. So in a way, you can think about basic income in terms of three waves. So the first wave, 70s, 80s, was mostly Europe and the United States. So this was the time when people were getting worried about welfare and people being trapped in welfare, and we're going to end welfare as we know it, right? So this is a famous statement by, Clinton actually as well, later on. One of the issues there of basic income is that people were being very worried about this focus on work activation all the time, right? So the idea was in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of this move towards we have to get more active, people have to be pushed into working more, and so on and so forth. So this is the time when people in various social support programs were, being more controlled. A lot of benefits were less generous, and so on and so forth. The basic income reaction at that time was basically to say, look, we need to really appreciate much more social participation in a broader sense. It's not just about work, it's about broader social participation. And issues around post-productivism, we don't need to focus too much on this productivism all the time. We need to kind of relax on this. Now, that was a part of the debate at that time, and it didn't really get picked up in mainstream policy very much. So what you have is occasionally people having support in the political field or in policy field or academics talking about it. But by and large, basic income was regarded very much as this utopian idea. Okay? So you have the discussion, but it's not really being taken very seriously by policy people at all. So the second wave, very interesting, then totally moved around. So suddenly we see this idea of basic income popping up in places where you wouldn't expect it, in Latin America and in Africa. Why wouldn't you expect it? Because these are places without strong social support systems, right? I mean, you know, in Europe and in the US you have, well, let's say in Europe for sure, we have a welfare state, a proper welfare state, right? Okay, of course, lots of differences across different countries. Even in the US, you know, I mean, you have support systems. You go to Latin America, you go to Africa, social support was extremely minimal, right? Now in the 90s and 2000, you get a lot of interest in basic income there. And partly it's tied with this idea of conditional cash transfers. You may have heard of this. These are programs where, for example, women get a monthly income support, provided that they do health checks for their children, provided their children are registered in school. So the important part of that program is that they were giving cash. You know, they were giving income support, cash, mostly to women actually. One of the first things they realized is that never ever give money to men. You know, it's very important. Just give the money to the women, then great stuff happens. Give money to men, yeah, things can go awkward, okay? So the point about conditional cash transfers, however, is that there was a condition attached, right? And what sounds like a very reasonable condition, you know, make sure your kids are healthy, have them checked, have them vaccinated perhaps, and make sure they go to school. And as long as they do that, you get that money. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that there's always going to be some reasons why people fall through the cracks. You know, there may be all sorts of reasons why a mother fails to put her kid in school for a time. And then you have a sanction. So, you know, so these are usually people who already have problems, and then they're being sanctioned, and, you know, and the money gets cut out. So one of the arguments, of course, of people is to say, well, perhaps we should build on this conditional cash transfer, but we should make it unconditional. You know, I mean, the best way to support people who are having a problem with income is to, you know, give them more income. You know, I mean, one of the biggest problems with poor people everywhere around the world is that they lack income. So if that's the problem, if that's the issue, we should try and do this much more unconditionally, or at least that's the argument. One of the interesting points is that there is a bit of a debate about whether conditional cash transfers are a road towards a basic income. So very famously in Brazil, Brazil actually has legislation that puts basic income into the legislation, but it doesn't actually, so the way it works is the basic income is part of the law, but then there's a separate process that has to provide the funding, the budget. And they haven't done the budget yet, right? Now, one of the things that Brazil does have is the Bolsa Familia, which is one of these conditional cash transfer programs. So some people argue that the Bolsa Familia is a road towards expanding into a full basic income. So, you know, we're already halfway there. Other people, however, argue that actually Bolsa Familia is blocking basic income because in some sense, you know, you're fixing on a program that is conditional and all the effort is put in there, and that next step is really problematic. So that really gets to the politics. So this is something, by the way, we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. But for now, just to say, the second wave, surprisingly, moved to the south, the global south, if you want, right? And there was a lot of talk about basic income. There were sort of various experiments being done, you know, in South Africa, Namibia, people were really talking about this. In Latin America, you know, Brazil, Argentina, lots of talk about basic income. And not just talk, I mean, some policy interest as well. So then we get to the third wave. So the third wave is then what's really been happening in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years. Now we're back into Europe, right? We're back, especially in Europe, partly also Canada and US. But this is really where the crisis started hitting, and now during the crisis and post-crisis, if you want, if you believe that that's where we are, people have started to think about, you know, we really need to rethink economic policy. And especially many people in the basic income movement who are favoring this are very, very worried about austerity politics. You know, this is the politics since the crisis where we just cut and slash and slash and slash, and we have to balance the budget. And lots of, you know, that has a lot of fallout. It has a lot of fallout on the people who are most vulnerable. So the people in the basic income movement who worry about this sort of thing, they see basic income as an alternative approach. instead of cutting, instead of being this whole austerity thing. This is the sort of quantitative easing for the people. Instead of rescuing the banks, we should fund the people, and then, make sure that as people have money, the economics, the sort of starts upswinging, and, we'll have all sorts of interesting results. So the idea there is very much that, yes, we need to rethink the welfare state. A lot of our older structures perhaps are no longer working as they should do. And we have problems with demographics and so on and so forth, right? We have problems with perhaps the fact that there's not enough jobs around, all these sort of things. That's all true. But we need to combine that with making sure that everyone has their fair share in the economy. So the problem with austerity politics, of course, is that as we're cutting, we're usually cutting a lot of services that affect people, at the bottom end of the distribution. So inequality keeps growing, right? So there's some recovery, there's some economic recovery, but it's not filtering through to everyone. So part of the argument here in the basic income movement is to think basic income is the sort of policy that sort of, distributes things much more fairly. It's an answer to austerity politics. So that's part of that context. So where are we today? So one of the things that we see, and if you've been interested in this, perhaps you caught most of this already. I think the single most important thing that happened in the last 5 years is Switzerland. So Switzerland had a citizens' initiative where they were proposing a basic income to be put in the constitution. And they managed to gather enough signatures so that they actually had to trigger a referendum. So the referendum will happen in June, right? Now, no one really expects this referendum to win, okay? I mean, there's a lot of resistance in Switzerland to this. But that's besides the point almost. What happened is, because they managed to get this on the agenda, suddenly the whole world started paying attention. Suddenly the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, all these, responsible, reputable newspapers start looking at basic income and not just thinking of it as a total utopia. Suddenly basic income becomes something that, people can debate. You can still be against, you can still be worried, you still have issues with it, but it's no longer just thought of as a crazy idea, right? And, one of the things, for example, if you sort of see lead economists who are suddenly coming out as, either really being in favor or at least, wanting to give it some consideration, And some of these people are perhaps rather surprising. So the Swiss initiative really kicked up this policy attention thing. And from there on, we see a lot of things happening, especially in Europe. So European Citizens Initiative was a similar thing. It failed, so this was at the level of the EU. I know cross countries people were trying to gather signatures, in Finland as well, actually, right? This, strictly speaking, failed. It didn't trigger the right amount of signatures. But again, it created a lot of discussion, a lot of groups were set up. So it really built this very important base, right? And a lot of media attention. We had a very interesting pilot project in India. Okay, so lots of interesting results, and it was done in a way that was, very scientific. So it wasn't just like a little pilot project by people who really like basic income. No, this was done with proper support, proper scientific methodology, and so on and so forth. So very interesting results. Of course, we have Finland. So, much to everyone's surprise, or at least outside of Finland, I'm not sure here, but I think even here people were quite surprised that your new government, first of all had the line in the government program saying that, we are going to commit to, but then actually followed up on it, because, it's not because something's written in a government program that it happens, but in this case it did. And that's where we are at the moment, right? We're really in the midst of preparing the first ever national experiment on basic income. That's a big deal, and, this is also the reason why everyone around the world keeps being interested in this, right? Huge amount of media attention, huge amount of policy attention. So, for example, at the moment, people in France, some politicians in France are interested. So what happened only a few days ago, there was actually, there was a workshop in the Finnish embassy in Paris, and Oli Kangas was there and some other people, because the French people want to know what's going on in Finland. The same thing with the Canadians. The same thing in Mexico. So, it's going to be a workshop in the Mexican Senate next month, they want to know about Finland, right? Everyone wants to know about Finland. So, very important. Similarly, in Netherlands, you may have heard this, a lot of the media reporting is a bit wonky, but in Holland, you also have a lot of cities being interested in experimenting with something like a basic income, right? They're actually a bit more focused on social assistance only, so it's more focused, it's less broad, but nevertheless, what they want to do is they want to change things with less control and allowing people to earn on top of the money they get as part of benefits, which goes a long way toward the basic income idea, okay? So the interesting thing about Holland is that, in Finland it's national, this is the government that has set it up. In Holland, it's bottom up. It's different communities, different municipalities that want to do this, right? And they're now actually negotiating with the government to allow them to experiment with this, And that's very much an ongoing process. So, this stuff is happening as we speak. So, things literally in the next couple of weeks may start kicking off here. So, finally, as I said, increased interest even in Canada and in France. Canada last week had a budget. The Ontario budget has a whole paragraph about saying, we seriously want to start thinking about the basic income experiment. I mean, those are serious things. So if you think back about the three waves, the first wave in the US, Canada, and Europe, people were talking about basic income, but no one was taking it seriously. Now it's totally different. Now these are proper governments, serious people all over the world who are no longer thinking this is a crazy idea. We should perhaps look at this, right? So that's kind of the context. So I want to say something about what is a basic income, because I talk about basic income, basic income, basic income, and people often confuse what it really is. So three criteria basically. Basic income is universal, it's individual, it's unconditional. So what does it mean when we say basic income is universal? So the best way to think about basic income is how is it different from what we have, right? So a lot of social support programs that you have, you look at Finland, you look at Sweden, you look at Belgium, Portugal, anything you want. I mean, a lot of social support programs that we have target specific groups. And they do this on the basis of different reasons, right? Sometimes it's because you have contributed before. Sometimes it's because there's a particular condition, like, you have a disability, or you have a long-term illness, Sometimes it's to do with, like things like child benefit, you happen to be a child, that's enough, okay? But different conditions, always targeted to different groups. The point about basic income is that you have no selectivity there. Every citizen is supposed to get it. Now, I say citizens, residents, question mark. Why? Because, of course, there's a big debate about, thinking about migration and so on and so forth. As you know, there's big debates anytime we're talking about social support, whether this should be for citizens, whether this should be for residents, and so on. But basic income is no different than any other policy in this regard. So you're going to have a little bit of a discussion there, right? But nevertheless, that question aside, this is a policy that covers everyone, which is unique, right? I mean, we don't have this. We have a huge amount of different policies targeted to different people. Basic income is a policy that, in principle, everyone should be entitled to. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that everyone benefits equally. So there is something that's called targeting within universalism. You can be universal, but nevertheless, your policy is targeted to a certain group. And basic income here is no different, right? So who does basic income target? Well, obviously, basic income targets the people who are most vulnerable, the people at the lower end of the income distribution, right? Okay, why is that the case? Because, think of more a moment, like if you have a basic income, you're probably going to have to somehow raise some taxes or find a way to fund it. And, when you start simulating this, when you start modeling this, there's going to be a point where richer people end up paying for their own basic income and subsidizing others. The same way this happens with other programs, right? So even within the basic income, of course, everyone is entitled, but nevertheless, the beneficiaries are always going to be at sort of the bottom end, if you want, or the lower end of the income distribution. But it's still very important that this is not selective, right? So we're not in advance identifying categories like, say, single mothers with 2 children, or people on disability benefit, and so on. We're not doing that. We're just saying everyone's entitled to basic income. And you know, and at some point, as you're getting better off, you'll just end up kind of paying for it more, right? Assuming this is income taxes or wealth taxes, different ways of doing it, right? And at the bottom end, everyone in some sense has that guarantee. That's the very important thing. So that's universalism, right? Criterion 1. It's also individual. So again, think of all the social support programs. Most of those are household-based, right? Which is actually very problematic because households these days change all the time. And I mean, people go together, people split up. You know, different programs have different rules. I mean, it gets very complicated very fast, right? And so one of the points is that in most of these programs, it means that, you know, if you are entitled to a certain benefit, that may depend on whether your partner has a certain income or also has benefits and so on and so forth. So these things are always linked, and it makes it very complicated in various ways, right? It makes it complicated for the individual, it makes it complicated for the system. So the point about a basic income is that everything is individual, you know? So it's individually calculated, which means, you know, you want to live separately, fine. You want to live together, fine, you know, it's okay. You want to live in a group commune, it's all fine. It's not going to affect your basic income. Your individual level is tied to you. That's it. It's not going to change. Okay? It's also individually paid. So it's actually paid to you. It's not paid to the head of the household or something like that. Which you might think, you know, oh, well, what's the big deal here? Well, you know, a lot of people, you know, who worry about gender equality, who think of this from a feminist perspective, they still identify a lot of cases where, you know, households still, you know, men get the money, control the money, and that has all sorts of effects. So one of the important feminist arguments for basic income is because it's individually paid, it basically gives more security, more freedom within the household to women, right? Okay? So that's the individual, universal, and this is the most controversial one. Basic income is unconditional, right? So again, social programs usually conditional on recipients satisfying various criteria. Sometimes these are categories, sometimes these are behaviors, right? But basic income is different. Basic income, there's no conditions attached. And no conditions attached means three things. There's no means test, so we're not going to look at whether you have other income, whether you have any wealth, whether you have any assets, whether you own a house, whether you own a car. There's a lot of programs where, you know, I mean, in some sense it's absurd, but there's a lot of people who are in poverty because they own a house. So they own a house, they can live there, but they actually have no money for food, so to speak, you know? Because their only other option is to sell the house, which, you know, under certain market conditions may just be not an option anyway, right? And then they sell the house and then they don't, you know, they have to start paying rent and so on and so forth. So this is a problem for a lot of people. So there's no means test, no income, no wealth test whatsoever. There's also no work test, of course, extremely controversial, you know? So basic income you get independently of whether you work, whether you have made effort to find work, whether you've done lots of solicitations, whether you're, you know, you're satisfying whatever willingness to work tests that you can come up. I was just in Holland talking to the people who are doing these municipal experiments, and one of the guys there was telling me that in some of these cities, the moment you get into social assistance, in your first week you have to apply 20 times for a job. I mean, think of this, 20 times. I mean, that's a lot, right? This is not like, you know, it's just a letter. I mean, you have to look for jobs, you have to look for availability jobs. It's one thing to say, well, you have to make some effort, but those are important, you know, those are rules. And they're very strict rules, and if people don't satisfy them, click, and they get sanctioned, and so on and so forth. So basic income wants to step away from this, okay? The idea is that the basic income you get, because you're a citizen, and everything else gets on top of that, you know? So you can work with the basic income, but you don't have to, right? You could also do something else. And something else, by the way, can be something that's very, very useful for society, like taking care of your children, you know, taking care of your parents who might be ill, volunteering, education, I mean, loads of things, okay? The point about basic income is that it's not assuming in advance that we have to direct you to these sort of things. It's assuming that we give you some income security, and then, you know, most people have the capacity and the willingness to engage in socially useful activities. So partly that's a sort of philosophical outlook. The third thing about unconditionality, no restrictions on use of the money. So this is a cash grant. We're not going to tell you, you should use your money for this and that, and you can't use your money for that. Okay? In the United States in particularly, there's been, the United States is great for examples for these sort of things. There's been a couple of people have proposed legislation that effectively means that, people who get social assistance or vouchers, they can't use for this meat, they can't use for that. So they have to buy the cheap chicken and not the steak and kind of things. And it's like, is that what we think social policy should be about? Like, not only do we put conditions on how people get the money, but we also want to be very sure that they use it in responsible ways. But it's us deciding what's responsible for them, right? And us usually meaning people who live in a very different way, so we might not even have a clue what it is like to live your life at that particular level of income, right? So basic income again goes against this. Basic income just assumes that, what we need is we need to give cash security to people, and we need to trust people to make the sort of decisions that happen to them. And of course, it may be that some people say, well, we're going to end up, spending a bit of money on buying cigarettes. It's like, so why would it be that, I'm not a smoker myself. I have a lot of problems, and I'm a big fan of smoking control and all these sort of things. But it would be very strange if government basically or policy decides that poor people are not allowed to smoke, but rich people are allowed to smoke, right? That's just weird. Okay, so those sort of inequalities we find are a bit unjustified. We being people who are into basic income argument. So that's what basic income is. It's individual, it's universal, it's unconditional. It's a very different thing, uniquely different from any other programs we have in place. Right? That's the important bit. Having said that, what I said so far is the core of basic income. Now, here's an important point. If you think of this in terms of policy, right, then we still have a lot of variation in that. So the idea of basic income as a unique idea is great, right? It's great. It is really something unique, and we can think about that. We can explore it in various ways. But we should keep in mind that within that, there's a lot of work to be done about all the little variations. So, for example, we need to think about the level of basic income. It makes a difference whether we pay people 200 euros a month, or 400, or 600, or 800, and so on and so forth. It's going to have a major impact in terms of the sort of things that basic income is going to do. So we have to have a debate about that, right? Okay? Very different thing if you propose a basic income 200 versus 800. It's just not the same thing. But it can all be, both of these can be a basic income. Think about funding. I've already mentioned taxes, but there's a variety of ways in which we can fund the basic income. Income tax is the obvious one, but we could use wealth taxes. Various people have proposed not just taxing income, but taxing wealth. Some people propose consumer taxes, very different arrangement again. Green taxes, link it to environmental behavior. Tobin taxes, you name it, Taxes on the exchange of information, taxes on speculation of currency, i.e. Tobin tax. You can find various ways of funding it, okay? In some cases, like in Alaska, for example, you have resources. They found oil, they licensed the oil, and then they decided that part of that money would go to every citizen. So, if you have resources like that, that could be a way to fund it as well. The way in Norway, rather, they fund the pensions, right, in large part. So, big decisions there, and depending on which one you take, you have a very different model, okay? This is going to have different policy effects and different political effects. We can think about duration. A lot of us, when we talk about basic income, we think about basic income for life. But perhaps it doesn't have to be that. Some people have proposed that maybe we should have a basic income that's 5 years or 10 years. And you can decide when to take it. So some of us like to study more, so we use the basic income for that. Other people say, well, I've got my 1 degree, I'm fine. but I might want to, I might want to use some of that for children. Or I might use part of that to go travel and see the world, or, you name it, different sort of things. But again, you decide when to pick it up, okay? But we have to have a debate. Is this going to be a lifelong thing, or is it going to be a temporary thing? Different ways of implementing. So, demo grant versions, everyone gets the cash. Think of this as, a basic income credit card or debit card. The government tops it up every month and you can use it. In other models, it's a negative income tax, so it's through the tax system. And, the people who have an income that's below a certain amount, they get the actual money, and the people who have to pay taxes, so to speak, the basic income is deducted from the taxes you owe. So that's another way to do it. But each of these different ways of implementing is going to have different effects. So these are just 4 examples, but you can think about more things, right? So you have a lot of variation. One idea, several models. When we think about policy, we're not just thinking about the idea, we're thinking about the very concrete different models, okay? How am I doing for time, actually? Okay. So I want to do 2 things, and then that's for today. I first want to look at this idea of basic income as a social critique. This is sort of the idea that basic income kind of is going to change society. And then I want to look at basic income as social policy. And there's slightly, it's not an either-or thing. In some ways, basic income does both. But it's important to kind of keep them separate, because when we're doing social critique, we're often talking in general terms, in general ideas, and the power of basic income as a different alternative. That's all great. When we talk about social policy, though, it is about the boring, nitty-gritty details, because it all has to work and it all has to fit in, and something that works in Finland may not work in Belgium. So we need to find a solution to that, and the other way around, okay? So 2 very different perspectives. One way to think about this idea of social critique is to think about the social contract. People often say that the post-World War we had a social compact or social contract where, in various ways in different countries across Europe and outside, we're trying to balance different interests, consumers and producers, employers, employees, so we have different interests, and there's something like a social contract where we have, instead of constant revolution, we have sort of, we have an arrangement where, in some sense, on the one hand, we allow the market to do certain things, but then we have a welfare state that takes care of various things that potentially could go wrong if we just let the market do its thing, okay? And that was partly the idea of the post-World War social contract. Everyone is kind of in it, we're all working together, and the idea is that somehow we create a society that allows, in some sense, to boost production, but everyone shares in it. We create a common good, and everyone's supposed to share in it. Now that's a fine story, but that story has been dismantled over a number of years now, right? So one of the very famous things that we know now is that economic inequality and economic insecurity has increased dramatically. I mean, this is the Piketty argument, right? So, there's a reason why Piketty's book became this bestseller. Here's an economist. Economists not really famous about caring about inequality, but there you have it, right? Here's one economist, talks about inequality, writes a whole book, historically informed, lots of data, and the main conclusion is that, this huge wealth inequality is a huge problem, right? Now, Piketty is sort of, Piketty brought this debate all up in the air, but he's not the only one. Loads of people have been talking about growing inequality. We know this. It's massive. And you can look on this stuff online and you see there's some really, I should have put this on there, sorry. There's some really, really interesting graphs where you ask people what you think is the distribution in a particular country. And then you compare that with the actual distribution, and it's incredible. We literally have no idea how unequal our societies are. Now, in a way, Finland is not the worst of countries. As you go to the Nordic countries, we're definitely not having the worst examples, but in lots of other places, this is the case. But even in Finland, you do have important inequalities. And with inequality also comes economic insecurity, right? So economic insecurity is what happens at the bottom. It's the fact that, even if you're not perhaps you're not poor at the moment, but you're at risk of being poor at any point. You know, your constant preoccupation is to make sure that you can, you can pay your rent, you can do this, you can do this. You know, you have to constantly budget everything. Like, money is constantly the problem. You know, and we're not talking about money for doing expensive things. We're talking about really basic needs kind of type of points, right? So one of the arguments, of course, or one of the reasons many people argue is that a lot of stable jobs have disappeared or are disappearing. Lots of people are more and more trapped in precarious jobs. Jobs that are short-term, part-time, pay very badly, don't have any benefits attached with it, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of people and more people moving in and out of different types of employment and unemployment, you know, flipping around there, okay? So this idea of a stable job that allows you to, you know, have job security, but also grow into a job and, you know, get a career and so on and so forth, that works for some people. But, you know, it works for the sort of, I mean, the amount of people that it works for are getting more narrow. So, and you know, Guy Standing, who's actually one of the people writing on this particular aspect, and you know, and a big basic income defendant, he calls this the precariat. He basically says there is a social class of people who are really trapped at the bottom in all these precarious situations, and you know, and it really becomes this sort of big movement, right? Another point that is sort of at issue when we think about social contract is that there's a lot of social contribution that's just going unrecognized. So, I mean, when the original social contract was put together, we had a very stable situation of, you know, the sort of the one breadwinner, usually the man, right? And then the woman stays home and takes care of the kids. But, you know, the idea was that the wage was going to be enough to take care of it. Now, over time, everything has changed, right? I mean, you know, of course, women start getting into the labor market, which is great, but it was also necessary, right? I mean, you know, the idea of one wage earner being able to support a family is just non-existent anymore, right? So, meanwhile, of course, demographics have changed. I mean, the idea of a household, you know, people are moving in and out of relationships in different ways. So all these things have changed. One important aspect is there's still a lot of social contribution going on, but that's being unrecognized. So people are still extremely focused on, you know, contributing is having a job, you know, having a job and paying taxes kind of thing. But, you know, I mean, especially people involved in the care agenda, there's a huge amount of work being done, taking care of kids, taking care of elderly, taking care of people who are sick and so on and so forth. It's usually done by women, and often by women who actually also have a job, right? So, you know, women often have two jobs precisely in this sort of respect. It's going unrecognized. So these are three different ways in which the sort of the basic social contract is broken down in a sense. And there's a further problem, because now we're in this nice time of austerity politics, right? Austerity politics, because it's so important that we balance the budget, and therefore we have to cut all these sort of things. Now, unfortunately, austerity politics really puts the pressure on those who are already very vulnerable. So one of the interesting things is there's really a bit of a paradox going on here, because for many, many years, the last couple of decades, the idea was that we need to activate people into work. We need to socially invest in people. We need to support them getting skills and work experience and so on. So the idea is that, you know, if we push people into work, then, you know, that they'll remain into work and so on and so forth. We'll get them out of this dependency relationship, and, you know, that's what we need to do in order to get, you know, combat poverty and social exclusion and so on and so forth. But that assumes investment, you know. The social investment state is not just individual investment, it's actually, you know, proper investment. Because a lot of these programs require the state to actually spend money in order to, you know, to have particular sort of guidance and support programs and so on and so forth, right? So now with austerity, all that money is being cut. So now we have this weird situation, a total paradox, where on the one hand, we're still talking about activation and social investment, and we're pushing people to go into labor market, very, very focused on labor market, right, mostly. But we no longer have the money available, or we don't want to make the money available to actually support them to do this, right? So that system is kind of grinding itself to a halt, right? And the people who suffer most are the people who are already vulnerable, right? Check out the increase in food banks, right? I mean, the amount of people who start using food banks across Europe is incredible. And this is not, you know, when we think of food banks, we often think of homeless people and so on and so forth. These are often regular families who need to start using food banks to supplement, you know, because they just can't make do, because, you know, jobs have gone down, wages have gone down, benefits have gone down, whatever you call it, okay? This is a serious problem. So this is basic income in the social contract. Basically, the point here is basic income as a social critique is to say, where we are at the moment in the system, there's a serious problem. What we put up there in terms of activation, and rethinking the social contract in terms of more responsibilities for individuals and so on and so forth, it's not working. The basic income alternative is to say we need to kind of, you know, we need to really laterally think, we need to go out of that. We need to, you know, forget about responsibilizing individuals and come up with an alternative approach. And the alternative approach, of course, is to, you know, become unconditional rather than more conditional. So, to what extent can we think about basic income as social transformation? Well, there's various ways you can think about this. So, I've already mentioned some of these things. So, care and gender inequality. A lot of people who focus on this think that if we have basic income, this is really going to transform society, right? It's going to, in some sense, change our thinking about gender roles, right? It's going to, you know, it's going to acknowledge, recognize a lot of this work being done at the moment, which at the moment is just not happening, okay? Ecological considerations, a lot of people worry about sustainability, climate change, all these sort of things. So the idea is that basic income can contribute here as well. Why? Because in some sense it counters this drive to productivism all the time. You know, when you have a basic income, you can spend it in various ways. But one way in which many people argue it could happen is because a lot of people might take some time out from the labor market, but get involved in all sorts of forms of volunteering and so on and so forth, right? So this is creating society in a different way, which is less focused on production, okay? Distribution and economic inequality is another big agenda point here. I've already mentioned this various times. So the idea, of course, is that with a basic income, we have this floor, and in some sense is going to create a more equal sharing of economic production. You know, instead of redistribution, we now talk about pre-distribution, and pre-distribution is sort of, you know, changing the rules of the games in such a way that everyone shares more equally. And then afterwards we have less to worry in terms of, you know, taking from some in order to give to others and so on. And then in terms of social inclusion, I mean, you know, rethinking participation, sort of, you know, not just focused on the labor market, but in a much more broader sense. Okay? So those are various ways in which basic income can be linked to social transformation. Basic income can also, and it has been linked to this idea of social justice. So there's quite a literature out there, and we'll have a philosopher, Simon Birnbaum, who's going to talk on this particular topic, although, you know, he'll have his particular version, or his particular presentation on this. But there is a huge literature on social justice, philosophy, social justice, basic income. These are so-called principled approaches. You know, this is about having a theory of justice and then arguing that basic income is a really key component of that. So 3 different versions, really. I mean, you know, these are broad brush, right? So a lot of people talk about freedom. There's various theories out there that basically say, look, freedom is a very important value, social value, right? It's something that we really, really deeply care about. Everyone should have equal freedom in a very clear sense. You know, different people talk about different types of freedom, right? Well, we don't have to worry about that right now. But the argument each time is that a basic income really does promote freedom in a particular way, okay? Why? Because it gives you resources, right? And resources usually is a precondition for being free. And of course, you know, if you have a system that puts you in control, I mean, think of some of the examples I mentioned before. You know, if you have a conditional system, it means everyone else is checking on you, how you use your grant, your money, how, you know, whether you work or not, whether you did the solicitations and, you know, you were looking for a job. You know, are you not earning too much, and so on and so forth. All these checks, they're supposed to disappear. So clearly, in that sense, we have more freedom. Democratic justifications as well, second part. A lot of people argue for basic income as a citizen's income. So the argument here is that, you know, it's because we are citizens, and being a citizen means that we have to have a certain status of being independent in a society, allowing us to participate. The argument is that it's incompatible to be a citizen if, in some sense, you're so dependent on administrations, in a sense, you know. I mean, sorry, let me start this over again. Think a moment what it would mean for you to live on social assistance in a situation where, you know, every week you have to go see someone. You're worried because every time there might be a sanction. Anything you do wrong, you tick the wrong box. Sometimes you make a little silly mistake, there could be a sanction. You're always worried about these sort of things. You're always at the mercy of the people opposite you, you know, who basically decide whether or not you're going to get your money, or what kind of things you have to do in order to be able to get your money, right? You have a system that keeps putting more and more obligations onto you, you know, more and more rules, more and more rules. Half the time you don't even know that the rules have changed, and so on and so forth. That system is very hard to then think of yourself as a citizen who is in equal footing with everyone else. So, you know, so that's the democratic justification. Democratic justification is to say, in order to be a citizen, we need to have a certain standard, you know, a certain status. Basic income is compatible with that, can grant us that, can promote that. There's also entitlement justifications. They usually start from the idea that, you know, there is a lot of goods out there that don't strictly belong to any individual. You know, if we find oil underneath our country, you know, does that belong to a single person? No, it doesn't. It belongs to, well, you know, some people argue it belongs to the whole world, but leaving that aside, you know, let's just assume that it belongs to the whole nation, country, citizenry, okay? So one way to distribute this is to say, well, you know, we license out the oil, and whatever profits we get from it gets distributed equally to every citizen. Why? Because if it's a common resource, then everyone's entitled to it, okay? Now, I used the example of oil, but you can think about loads of different things that way. Some people argue that, you know, say for example, you know, things like information. You know, information is one of these things that is very, very valuable, and it's very hard to tie to an individual in a real sense. So there's a lot of arguments to say that things like information flows should be regarded as common goods. And perhaps there's ways we can tax those or license those, get money out of those, and that money, instead of going to private companies, should perhaps go to the citizens. You know, that could fund a basic income. So those are entitlement justifications, okay? That's just to give you an example of how different philosophical perspectives think about basic income and justice. But as I said, you know, we'll have Simon Birnbaum talk about at least some of this in a bit more detail. Okay, is this going? Yes. So far, social critique. Now, I just want to talk about social policy. How am I doing for time? Okay. I want to do another quote. This is actually probably one of my most favorite quotes. So Brian Barry, the late Brian Barry, he died a short while ago, is a really, really interesting political philosopher, but someone who always had very practical mind. So here is one of the things he wrote. He says, like, I mean, imagine that someone asks you whether you're in favor of basic income or not. So he's basically saying, well, asking about the pros and cons of basic income as such, it's like asking about the pros and cons of keeping a feline as a pet without distinguishing between a tiger or a tabby. So tabby is like your regular house cat. So if someone asks you, are you in favor of felines? It makes a difference whether this is a little house cat or whether this is a huge tiger. So Brian Mary's basically saying the same thing about basic income, you know? You cannot talk about whether or not a basic income is a good idea until you get into the details of the different models, okay? So from a policy perspective, this is a really, really important point, you know? We can't sort of just talk about basic income being bad or a good idea. It's great on one level to talk about that idea, But really, when we need to assess this properly, we want to look at the details, right? And that gets us into the idea that basic income really is a family of proposals. That's the way I look at it. You know, it's not just one idea, it's a family of proposals. So we have variation in terms of design and implementation. I already mentioned this before. But think for a moment that design and implementation also means different policy effects. So think about all the things that we hope basic income would contribute to. Will it help poverty? Will it reduce poverty? Will it promote health? Will it promote education? Will it promote social participation? Well, that depends on which model of basic income we're talking about. Take it one step further. Think about political effects. You know, if we have different policy effects, it also means we have different political effects. What do I mean by political effects? We have different winners and losers, right? Different winners and losers means different groups promoting basic income, resisting basic income, different types of coalitions being built, okay? Different opportunities for putting basic income on the agenda, making sure that it stays there, political stability, very important, okay? So those are important things, and it all starts with this variation. So we need to really think very carefully how we design basic income, because how we design it means it will have different effects and it will have different political effects as well. So, 3 challenges. We need to worry about evidence, we need to worry about policy, we need to worry about politics. The evidence challenge is very straightforward. At the moment, basic income doesn't really exist in a very, you know, not at least in the way in which we often think about basic income. There are some schemes out there that look like a basic income, but, you know, there's a question about whether they really compare to what we have in mind. So we have a genuine question, which is, look, we need to know what a basic income can do, or which model of basic income works best. And in order to do that, we need to find that out. That, by the way, is why these experiments are important, right? This is why experimentation, in some sense, is a very important part of the step. We also have a policy challenge. So what is the policy challenge? Basic income is not going to work on its own. It's always going to work integrated in a policy environment. That means there are other programs, other policies that interact with the basic income, right? And that interaction is something that we need to figure out, that we need to start looking into, okay? So different models of basic income will interact in different ways with programs that you have in place. And then there's questions, should we adapt some of these other policies? Or is the basic income something that just has to fit with what we already have, you know? So all sorts of very important policy questions. And then there's the political challenge, namely, how do we get basic income to go through all these different hurdles, right? So this is all about strategy. I'm going to skip this one, you can just look at that. And by the way, on this one, we put in another article. If you're interested in this, there's an article that reviews some of the policies that look like a basic income in different parts of the world. So that'll be on the Moodle. So this is political hurdles. So that is actually the stuff that I will be talking about in more detail later. So the rabbit is kind of, you know, this is actually one of my favorite pictures. So I don't even know whether it's copyrighted or not. We'll see about that. But so this is what I think about basic income, right? It's all about, you know, finding all the hurdles and trying to get over them. So here are just 4 issues, political issues that, you know, in some sense we need to think about. We need to think about our constituency. It's not just about people benefiting basic income, but, you know, it's also about people, in some sense, thinking that their basic income is so important that they want to put political pressure on the system, that, you know, that in some sense they want to campaign for it, they want to vote for it, and so on and so forth, you know. From a political perspective, that's what we want. And maybe that's harder to get to than you would imagine. And this is something I'll be talking about in a few weeks. We need to think about coalitions, you know. I mean, think about parties, but think also about movements. I mean, we may have very different proposals depending on whether you talk to a left-wing party, a right-wing party, okay? So how do we build a coalition that's sufficiently broad without actually giving up on the sort of models that we wanted to start out with, okay? A lot of people argue that basic income is great because we have support from the left and the right. But that works if you only think of basic income as an idea. You know, that it's just about basic income against the rest. But if you think about basic income as different models, then you have different winners, different losers, depending on which model you adopt. That means different parties supporting, different stakeholders supporting, different coalitions. Okay? That's an important challenge. Stability is an important challenge. It's one thing to have a basic income in place, but how do we make sure that's going to stay there? You know, I mean, what's the point in having a basic income and then the next government basically says, well, forget about it. You know, I mean, and this happened before, right? So, you know, the Labour government in the United Kingdom put in place the Child Trust Fund, where every child was going to get some money and it would get into a bank account, and at 18 you would have a big chunk of money. The next Conservative coalition basically said, forget about it. You know? So we had that little experiment for 5 years, and you know, stability, that policy is gone, right? So what's the point? I mean, loads of people were spending a lot of political effort putting the policy onto the agenda, and then it's gone. There's no point in that. And then implementation issues. We need to make sure that, you know, once we think about basic income, we also need to make sure that we can implement it in a way that actually delivers on what it claims to do, and that it avoids any negative effects, right? And as we're going to see in a couple of weeks, there could be some implementation issues that are a lot more trickier than you imagine. And with that, I think I'm done for today. So I hope you had a bit of an idea of what we'll be talking about, and especially the most important thing is to keep in mind this distinction between thinking about basic income as a general idea, thinking about it as concrete policy, lots of variation, lots of decisions to do.